So I've been playing an abnormal amount of Dragons Dogma 2 and have learned quite a bit about the game. While I'm doing extremely well in my playthrough, there's a few mistakes that I was making that did to some degree hurt my progress and even slowed my playthrough down, as some of these mistakes that we're making were actually diminishing the power and the ability to play the game more effectively. So in today's video, I'm going to be showing you quite a few tips and tricks I wish I knew at the start of playing Dragons Dogma 2 so you don't make these same mistakes. These tips and tricks are going to make sure you're not missing out on more simple things that actually ends up being bigger than you think, so your playthrough is an amazing experience. With that out of the way, let's dive right on in. What is up everybody, welcome back to Forever Gaming, where you can stay up to date on the latest in gaming. This includes news, builds, and guides just like you see in today's video. If you like the content you see here today and want to help the channel out, drop me a like to get this video out to other gaming fans, but if it wasn't for you, change it to a dislike. So first off, let's talk about vocations, core skills, and augments. This is arguably one of the most important things in the entire game, as this is going to give you a ton of power for each individual vocation, and if used correctly, you can get more power from leveling other vocations. So obviously, starting off, you're going to have access to the fighter, the archer, the mage, and the thief, each of these with their own unique playstyle. As you progress through the game, you're going to find more and more vocations doing various tasks. As you level each of these vocations, what's going to end up happening is you're going to have access to more skills. These skills can be purchased from the vocation guild, and as you continue to level up, you're going to get core skills and most importantly, augments. The most important thing to note about the augments is you get more and more as you level up each individual vocation, and they're actually passive that can be transferred between different vocations. So for example, if I start off as an archer, the archer has a handful of augments that are pretty valuable, like things that give you stamina. Now let's say I'm done with the archer and I didn't exactly like it, but I do want to try out the thief. I can actually take that endurance augment and give it to the thief as a passive ability. What this essentially means is, as you're progressing through the game, if you really want to min-max what your characters and your different vocations can do, it's best to level every single one of them, as they give you a ton of extra passives that can be carried over to other vocations. Of course, you don't have to do this if you like a specific playstyle, but if you want to min-max like I like to do, you definitely should look into the augments. Moving on, let's talk about combat, and we're going to have a few combat focused tips for this one. But the first that you need to understand is whenever you're facing off against larger foes, you have a various amount of ways that you can actually deal with them, and the most powerful of them is toppling them over. This of course makes it much easier for you to hit those weak points. You can hit weak points at any given time, but if they're laying down on the ground or knocked out a little bit, it's much easier to pinpoint those weak points. One great way to tell if foes are going to topple over is by looking at them visually. Sometimes they'll be standing on one leg as if they're about to fall over. Every single class has access to grabbing the opponent and pushing them. On the keyboard, it's just pressing E and then pushing forward and they will topple over. I'm not sure what it is for controller, but either way, this will actually topple foes over. If you're playing classes like the warrior, you can actually use your shoulder check to actually topple them over as well. I haven't tried any of the other vocations to like knock them over because I just typically press E on them, but I'm sure there's other ways that you can actually assist in toppling foes over. And this is going to be my next tip because this is very powerful to help you kill enemies much more efficiently. While we're on the subject of combat, let's talk about cutting off limbs and knocking opponents out. If you've ever played a game like Monster Hunter, then you should be fairly familiar with this mechanic where you can actually cut off limbs and knock monsters out from hitting them in their weak points in certain spots. And just like in Monster Hunter, you can do that in Dragons Dogma 2. For example, if you're playing a warrior and you're using a great sword, then it's very easy for you to slice off limbs that could in theory disable moves and attacks that enemies can do. Very similar to the mace with the warrior, if you hit things in the head, say for example a chimera, you can actually stagger them and not have one of the heads actively attack you for a duration. This is going to be an exceptional way for you to just be able to stop enemies from using attacks to some degree. And just like in Monster Hunter, if you do cut off some limbs, I've noticed that I was able to gather some of them. Unfortunately, just like in Monster Hunter, you'll never get anything you want, but still a great option for you there. Moving on to something a little more subtle, if you're going to areas that have restrictions on them, there's actually a pretty cool way that you can actually blend in, and that's wearing disguises. As I said a moment ago, there are locations on the map where there's a restricted area that you can't necessarily be in, and if you're there too long and caught by a guard, they will attack and thereafter arrest you. This extends to other locations in the world. I'm not necessarily going to point those locations out because this could be a little bit spoilery, but ultimately you can actually use disguises is so that you can blend in and not be attacked, and this is a great way for you to complete those more stealthy focused missions without having an army of enemies chasing after you. While we're talking about restricted areas in Vernworth, let's go over a really cool item that you can get really early in the game that's going to be invaluable through your entire playthrough all the way up until late game. But as you go into the Vernworth Keep area, you'll notice that the area is restricted and you can kind of get attacked if you're not wearing a disguise like we previously mentioned in the last tip. Within this area, you're going to have a mission that tells you to go into the tower and do some stuff in there. There's actually multiple missions. This doesn't necessarily need to be specific to this mission to do it, but nonetheless, you're going to get a disguise somewhere in there, and you can use this to wander around and walk around, which is very important. If you actually go into the main console chamber and you head over to the back, you'll see it here visually on screen. There's an area that leads you to the very tip top of the keep. This is a huge overlook that has multiple chests as you lead up there, but most importantly, at the very top, there are going to be 3 chests, one with a very special item inside. This item is called the Dragon's Gaze, and what this does is it gives you the ability to locate wake stones all over the area. This is one of the most powerful items in the entire game because this must have wake stone shards and not miss out on any of them. Of course, there's always going to be a limited amount of wake stone shards, but at the very least you'll not miss them since you can actually see them all over the map. Again, this one is a little more closer to spoilery of gameplay, but this is a invaluable one that you should pick up early game since you're going to be in Vernworth anyway to do the MSQ. Moving on, while you're actively going to be looking for those wake shards and picking up items, you will probably have noticed through your playthrough that wake is a massive problem in the game and it's something you absolutely want to solve for. And one of the easiest way to do this is look for these golden beetles all over the map. These are much easier to spot at night, but night is significantly more dangerous. But nonetheless, these gold beetles, when you consume them, will actually give you some increased weight, which can be pretty valuable to help keep your weight down. This is more of a simple one I'm sure most of you may have figured out, but again, you may not have, so hopefully this helps you out. While we're on the subject of picking things up, let's talk about picking up allies and foes. So if you've ever faced off against a powerful opponent and you've not necessarily leveled up, or you're just not as powerful as the opponent you're facing off against, you'll notice from time to time your allies will go down and they'll be in pretty dangerous situations. One really cool trick that you can do is using the same E key on mouse and keyboard to pick up allies and reposition them. This is going to be a great way for you to resurrect allies because repositioning is going to be really important so that you don't just get stomped when you're trying to resurrect certain allies. This actually extends to enemies as well. It's going to require you to actually like hit them and push them to the side a little bit. Like you'll see a stagger animation on them, but you can actually pick up foes and throw them as well. This is a awesome way if you don't necessarily care about looting their body and you just want to get an instant kill. You can pick up a goblin, something humanoid size, maybe a little bit bigger. I'm not sure how this scales. I'm not sure if it's based on your strength or the size of the opponent, but either way, you can just pick opponents up and just fling them off the side of the hill for an instant kill. Just be smart on how you use your picking up because believe it or not, you can actually throw your allies to objectives, throw them to safety, many other things like that that are very subtle that you may have missed that you can actually use to give yourself some massive advantage in combat situations. Now, while we're on the subject of allies, let's talk about the pawn system a little bit. So as you know, you're able to create one main pawn that's going to be usable through the entire game and can be changed at will depending on what you want to do with them. This pawn is mandatory to stay alive because if it isn't, you can actually go to the rift stones to get other pawns from other players. Now, one thing to note about the pawns from other players is a few things. First off, the pawns from other players actually come with stats that you actually should be able to look at before purchasing them. Some of these stats are really important. Some can like show you resources around the map. Some are better at gathering. Some are more likely to use skills depending on their personality type. Things like that. So before you buy a pawn from the rift, it's important to check their stats because if you're looking to find aura, you may want to specifically look for that because there are pawns that can, for example, show you how to find aura if that's what you're looking for. Piggybacking off of that tip, my next tip is also their past experiences. Pawns from other worlds can actually show you exactly what they learned in previous experiences with their master. So for example, you go to a zone you've never been, but you had a pawn that had a master that went to that zone. They in theory could show you exactly what was there, hidden things, treasure chests, things like that. This actually extends to enemies as well. Your pawns can actually tell you how to face off against certain enemies if you never faced them before. Simply by pressing the go command, you can get them to either go to the location of the said thing that they're talking about, and this actually extends the quest too. They'll actually give you a direction on how to get to the quest, so if you're a little bit lost, they'll navigate you through. And there you have it. Those are my tips and tricks I wish I knew before starting Dragons Dogma 2. I tried to give you information and tips that were not so spoilery besides the one, and not so obvious, so in theory, it should make your playthrough. With that in mind, if the video did help you out, consider leaving me a like because that helps me out tremendously. Or possibly subscribe to Forever Gaming if you like content just like this, because we'll be keeping you up to date on some future updates for Dragons Dogma 2. And just like that, my name's The Saga, this is Forever Gaming, and I thank you so much for watching.